I'm doing like a book talk on Simone de Beauvoir's really famous book, The Second Sex, for International Women's Day. Just because it is such an important book for all of us women in this world. And lovely to see you, Natasha. Such a pleasure to have you here. Yes, thank you. I appreciate it. It's going to be just like kind of a brief chat because it is a huge book. It's 800 pages long. So I'm not going to go through 800 pages. I'm just narrowing it down so it's a little bit easier to kind of grasp. And if you so wish to go and read it afterwards, of course, like do so by all means. It is such a seminal work. So thank you so much for joining. It is such a pleasure to see you here. And happy International Women's Day, of course, and also happy St. Patrick's Day for all the Irish fellows across the world. It is St. Patrick's Day today as well. So, very nice to see everyone here. So I'm just going to get started. Hopefully you find this interesting. But basically, Simone de Beauvoir was a French philosopher and writer in the 20th century. Now, this 800-page book is like her magnum opus, and it's considered like one of the most important books of feminist philosophy. Absolutely seminal work. It was actually written in 1949, which is crazy. Some of the themes are so relevant even now, like even though it was written like more than 50 years ago. It's fascinating that she had so much insight into sort of human behavior, you could say. So the book explains how like women have been shaped to become the other, the negative counterpart to man. And I sort of, by examining history, myths, biology, she kind of paints a picture of why women are subjugated to men and how womankind should just respond because of this. So this book is for feminists, anyone who's interested in philosophy or anyone interested in classics. It's quite a dense read, but it is such a powerful topic. And she's written this line, this quote, which is, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman." And she wrote this obviously in 1949, and so it was seen as very controversial that she'd written about womankind in this way. And basically, the idea is that womanhood is a product of cultural forces as opposed to an innate quality. Obviously, right now, it seems quite obvious, when we think about it today. But when you think about it, it was like actually published more than 50 years ago. It was seen as so controversial, and actually it was a contested claim. And although like the situation obviously has improved like vastly for many people over like the last 60 years, her ideas obviously is still very relevant. And before I dive in, I just want to take a quick look at two concepts that she like sort of uses a lot throughout the book. The two central themes are, one is the other. So basically, everything has an opposite side. So, for example, she calls it like the thesis and the antithesis. So, without the antithesis, the thesis would not exist. So, for example, a slave cannot be a slave if there is no master, and the master cannot be a master if there is no slave. So, in this way, without woman for man to rule over, there would also be no man. So that's kind of her thinking behind the other. The other aspect is immanence versus transcendence. So immanence is sort of used to describe the domain given to women, which is a secluded realm of being passive, static, and immersed in yourself. So transcendence is the opposite of that. So you're beyond yourself. And so she says that, like, a lot of the time, women have been pushed back into this role of immanence and become very passive. Hello, everyone, for joining. I'm talking about this really, really important book for International Women's Day, The Second Sex by French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. So, feel free to join in. If you have any questions, do ask. So she starts off with the idea of animal species. Like, obviously, you'll notice lots of differences between male and female animals, and this is obviously true of humans. But many actually argued that, because of these differences, we should also be treated differently in society, which obviously is a bit like, how much of this is actually in a reality. This argument doesn't seem to sort of hold up at all. And yeah, there are biological differences. Hi, thank you for joining. Talking about hi Soba, lovely to see you. I'm talking about the really important book for International Women's Day, which is The Second Sex by French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. And it's 800 pages long, so I've condensed it down completely. So basically she says, like, in addition to sort of biological arguments, psychoanalytical explanations for sort of the inequality of male and females have also been put forward, and one of those arguments is by Freud. Freud actually believed that women suffered from penis envy, which basically is inherently flawed because it's based on a male model. So Beauvoir says this concept can only exist if male genitalia is considered the norm, which obviously it cannot be the norm if there is two sides. So the second point she makes is most societies are patriarchal now, but it didn't actually used to be. And the current patriarchal societies have created this whole idea of women being the other. So actually women used to wield apparently a lot more power than they used to. So in actually prehistoric societies, there were actually matriarchal societies. So because it was largely based on farming, these societies kind of shared their property and regarded children as an invaluable asset and the means of sort of perpetuating society. And because women were capable of obviously bearing children. Hi, thanks for joining. Talking about The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, which is a very famous book. For International Women's Day, I'm condensing 800 pages into a very short chat, just so you can see whether you really want to read it. It is incredibly important even now, even though it was written in 1949, which is just amazing. And she has a lot of key concepts, so do go back and check this live out, like once you get a chance. But I was talking about, like, most societies were matriarchal in prehistoric times, and actually women were seen as very important parts, even as deities, as goddesses, especially like fertility goddesses. Now obviously when the Romans and the Greeks took over, that status completely was relegated. They would actually in the past take the mother's clan name instead of the father's clan name, which obviously is a vast change from Western societies now, where a lot of women take their husband's name or the male lineage name. So it's changed a lot. So she's saying once this kind of matriarchal sort of shift happened to patriarchal society, we have basically seen women becoming a second status as the other. And basically, now women, even like apparently slavery in the Roman times and the Greek times, had taken over women's work. So basically women were left out of the workforce, as a result, and so they were seen as no longer useful in society, which obviously created a massive problem. Hi everyone, thanks for joining. Talking about condensing 800 pages of Simone de Beauvoir's classic book, The Second Sex for International Women's Day. So I'm trying to sort of get as many points through, and do check this out again if you find this interesting, because it is a lofty piece of work. It was talking about the shift from matriarchal to patriarchal sort of societies in prehistoric times to modern times. And so basically even female goddesses were relegated from the Greek and Roman times, from being like really important fertility goddesses. They were actually relegated, so they were seen as basically goddesses of immanence being sort of passive. So for example, Zeus became like the head god, whilst all the female gods like Gaia, who was the main god before, the goddess of the world, of earth, had been relegated to a passive status. So it's really interesting to see how the shift from history has shown women to suddenly become the other. Saying hi to everyone who's joined. I'm not reading, don't worry, I'm not reading 800 pages. I'm condensing 800 pages of Simone de Beauvoir's classic, The Second Sex for International Women's Day. So I hope you enjoy this and may find this quite useful if you want to actually go out and read it. So the third point she actually makes in the book, which is, so men were... Oh, cool. I hope you get to see a recap of this after when I put this out. So yeah, thank you for joining as well. So much appreciated. But basically, men were seen as the active force in creating life and the rules in society. But they also needed this to change, to consolidate the power of patriarchy. And one of the major shifts in history was the development of private property and familial inheritance. So, for example, like in early society, all property was actually held communally. Everyone would have a share of this property. But in patriarchal societies, this shifted so that the men became the main private property owners. And basically all that accumulation of wealth went to men instead. And especially since men then also carried the family line, basically women were completely excluded from inheritance. And so marriage actually sort of reinforced this idea, because they basically stopped women from acquiring property, and women as a result kind of became property themselves. Oh, hi, Kirstine. Lovely to see you. I'm going through condensing Simone de Beauvoir's very famous book, The Second Sex, for International Women's Day, just to get the main points out. So whoever wants to actually read it can read it if they want to, but obviously it's a very long book, so I'm just condensing it to make it easier for other people to go out and read it. But yes, so we're talking about the shift of... private property for men, inheritance laws. Yeah, exactly. Simone de Beauvoir is like, yeah, a goddess in herself, honestly. I totally agree. I love her books too, Kirstine. So yeah. And as you know, as you've probably read, is the fact that, you know, the shift in private property to male hands, how marriage also reinforced this idea of women being second class in terms of getting private property. It sort of reinforced this idea that men have more power in society, and obviously that's in a lot of societies, like even I remember in India, women were denied to even have the right to have property even after their husband died. So that's also a shift of economic power, which is a really big change in history. But in the 15th century, like, women were obviously taking on loads of really important roles, you know, like, it's quite interesting. So I think it's in the 17th century France, women were discussing philosophy, literature, art in sort of literary salons in France. And, you know, despite having actually no formal education, they were like obviously still having these discussions in these salons. So I think there were some really famous authors like Marie de Gournay and Madame de Lafayette. Obviously, I've butchered those French names, so I apologize. But they actually ended up becoming more famous than their husbands. Hello, everyone who's joined. I was just talking about Simone de Beauvoir's classic, "The Second Sex" for International Women's Day, and we're just chatting about like the how the power shifted across history. Even in the 17th century, women were, even with no power, women were discussing such important issues. And, we're talking about, for example, certain French authors who actually ended up becoming more famous than their husbands, because even though they didn't have formal education. And then in the 19th century, obviously, the position of women actually still remained inferior to that of men, which is quite sad, which is when Simone de Beauvoir was around. So, for example, in the 1918, women still earned less than half of what men earned in the US. And in the same period, female miners in Germany actually earned a quarter less than men, even when they actually collected the same amount of coal. So, there was a massive power shift throughout history where women certainly just got relegated into a second role. And obviously, religion played a massive part in how sort of society influenced the way humans think and act, and also how they view women. So very much so, many religions situate women beneath man right from beginning in sort of many sort of patriarchal religions. But then also non-religious sort of myths also perpetuated this. So myths around menstruation is still a huge deal, right up till now. I think even as late as the 1940s, many people in the south of France actually believed if salted by a menstruating woman, pork cured by or cured for ham or for bacon would go bad. I'm like, this is just crazy because these thoughts still exist. And obviously, it seems kind of ridiculous when we think about it today, but we still say things like, well, it's her time of month, which implies obviously like menstruation has some kind of mystical sway over women, that actually women can no longer control their own behavior, which obviously is also reinforces this idea that there's something wrong with women for having periods. So, this is a concept she'd been talking about in 1949, which is incredible. She also talks about the process of becoming a woman right after birth. So when children are born, their minds are the same. But when society divides them into girls and boys, it creates two different ways of being in the world. Young boys are already told to be manly as soon as they're born, and girls are forced to be nurturing. So she was saying this is already reinforcing this idea of the other, women being the other. And the other transformation happens as girls sort of enter their first sort of puberty, and it's a really painful experience, and it's actually made a lot worse by the atmosphere of sort of shame and taboo that's actually surrounded by, women's bodies from very early childhood. And it also forces the realization that women's fate are connected to that of her mother, that she's a childbearer, she has to carry the weight of the risks and the consequences of, having a child. So, already, the difference in treatment is apparent. And then the next transformation, of course, is actually adulthood, where when people lose their virginity, it's seen as sort of going into adulthood. But for women, this event is actually only one marker of a very painful path to sort of mature sexuality. And then, of course, pregnancy is the next stage where, it kind of deepens what you call woman's imminence being sort of passivity, by subordinating her own needs to the child. So Simone de Beauvoir feels that even when like a child is born, the needs of the fetus just takes over the person. And so any initial feelings of transcendence of being pregnant, the woman actually just feels very replaced by like the child's needs. And so the psychologist William Wilhelm Stekel said, actually, he went so far as to describe morning sickness as a manifestation of woman's unconscious will to expel the fetus like a badly digested meal, which is obviously quite a powerful imagery. And it has been said that, yes, actually, our bodies actually at the beginning try and reject as much as possible because it's sort of almost like a invasion. So it's interesting how bodies are just taken over. Next form of subjugation is how women dress. And until the woman is freed by old age, because suddenly you don't need to you don't need to look attractive anymore as such, which is quite a depressing thought as well, where, you know, older women just don't seem to be seen, which is a real problem in itself. And then the next point, I think this is point 12, Beauvoir actually believed that prostitution is a way of dividing women so they're easier to conquer. So women who have used their bodies as exploitable capital, she says, are vilified and called loose, which also makes monogamous marriage seem more desirable. And while sex workers choose their profession, she feels like the truth is that it's a form of desperation and oppression. So her feeling is that basically, like, sex work was created to divide the classes of women, and get more power over them. Obviously, there's been a lot of debate around this since then, regarding agency. So obviously there has been some change in attitudes towards, for the last 60 years, towards sex work and generally also monogamous relationships. So, and then obviously now we have mass movements, mass women's movements. But even today, like she says, despite like many women fighting for their rights, the majority of women are still sort of subjugated, and it eliminates any kind of feeling of responsibility for your own situation, and actually makes women believe like sort of they're powerless to change it. So that's another aspect she wants to sort of highlight. But then, the last point she makes is, to be truly equal, man and woman have to see each other as peers, and that it will require mutual recognition of the subjectivity of both man and woman. So this means neither men or women have to objectify each other. They cannot objectify each other. So no more billboards of like half-naked women. Seriously. This also needs to change. But women also have to let go of their passivity in order to find transcendence. Obviously, a lot of women find security when it comes to being passive, but in order to not become the other, as Simone de Beauvoir talks about, she has to transcend this. So she says you need to adopt a new courageous, active stance. So the key message in the book is, no one is born a woman. It is something you become. Rather than sort of a biological category, it's a creation of history, religion, and myths, sort of which are constantly reproduced by sort of patriarchal social forces. For women to actually become free, she says, we all need to understand that woman is nothing more than a social construct. So that is 800 pages summarized in 25 minutes. I hope you found that interesting. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, absolute seminal work, really important in philosophy, for a feminist philosophy. So, if you do get a chance to read it, obviously take your time. It's very long and it's incredibly dense. But yeah, the themes are still very relevant today. We are still celebrating International Women's Day. And actually, hopefully, one day we won't even need to celebrate International Women's Day, because every day will be a day for everyone. But here we are. So we're having this discussion. So thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate everyone who chimed in. And I will probably do more of these in the future. But if you have a book that you find interesting, do let me know. So thanks for joining me.